So, okay, it's already recorded. So, okay, good good morning for Professor Pris and good evening
Good
for
evening.
Indonesia Indonesian audience.
Good evening,
So,
good
yeah,
evening.
uh, thank you for joining us, and welcome to this special session. So, as I mentioned before, this session hosted by Uberman's Philosophy in collaboration with Intuitionistic ID, and also supported by friends and partners across Indonesia's philosophical community. So, my name is Vito. I'm from Faculty of Philosophy at Universitas Gadjah Mada. So I have the privilege of serving as tonight's moderator. So yeah, it is a truly wonderful to see the participant. So there is a 32 participant in here joining us from different parts of Indonesia and beyond. Students, maybe academics, researchers, or and also philosophy enthusiasts. I think yeah. So all gathering here to explore a topic that challenges the very foundation of what we think logic is and maybe ought to be. So it is a really interesting topic, and yeah, this is not just a niche technical topic, but it's extremely interesting and really insightful, I think. So the title for our event is, as I mentioned before, like transconsistency as an alternative paradigm in contemporary philosophy of logic. So, what the topics mean? So maybe I could like explain a little bit for the context for the audience. For over at least over 2 millennia, the foundation of logic have been defined by a single assumption that contradiction must be avoided at all costs. From we can say that from Aristotle to Frege, from Hilbert to standard mathematical logic, and the principle of non-contradiction has been treated as a sacred things. And yeah, I think according to the classical view, if a system contains even one contradiction, the entire structure collapses. And yeah, because from a contradiction, anything flows, or this is what we call as the principle of explosion. So, but in the last few decades, a revolution has unfolded and emerged remarkably, not by abandoning logic, but by advancing it uh, through the work of paraconsistent logics and dialectics. A new possibility emerged, uh, that the contradiction is not does not necessarily lead to triviality, and in fact some contradiction may be sometimes true. So transconsistency is a proposal to move beyond the classical idea of consistency as an absolute requirement for rational thought. So yeah, maybe we could ask like what if contradiction can be contained than eliminated, or what if truth the and contradiction are not mutually exclusive, or what if logic itself needs to evolve? And I think that kind of question that we're gonna explore tonight. And yeah, tonight we have the opportunity to explore those questions with the very person who introduced this paradigm. I think yeah, it is my profound honor to introduce our speaker, Professor Graham Priest. Professor Priest is one of the most influential living philosopher of logic. He is a distinguished professor of philosophy at Graduate Center, City University of New York, and has also taught at University of Melbourne and multiple leading research center worldwide. So yeah, he is known globally as a pioneer of paraconsistent logic, dialecticism, and of course, non-classical logics and philosophy of logics, of course. So his books include In Contradictions, which is the very title of our event right now, and then Job Truth to Be a Liar, and one of my favorite, An Introduction to Non-Classical Logic, and dozen of articles that have reshaped contemporary logic, philosophy of language, and even metaphysics. So to put it simply, if today we are able to talk meaningfully about truth, contradiction, and transconsistency, it is thanks to the work of Professor Priest. So, Professor, thank you for being here. It's an honor to host you. So
Thank you for
maybe
having me.
uh, we can hear your presentation, and screen is yours.
Okay. So first of all, how long do we have altogether, and how long do I have to talk to you?
Okay, so we have a pretty flexible time, so we can accommodate like maybe 30 to 40 minutes for your presentation, and then we can continue with commentary, and then we can continue with Q&A section. But I think it's pretty flexible for us. So I think it's totally fine if we can like talk more and then extend the time, especially for your presentation.
Okay. All
Mhm.
right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Um, it's very early on a Sunday morning in New York here, and I was out of the opera late last night, so I'm not sure that I'm entirely awake, but I'll do my best. But thank you for having me. Even though I'm Australian, I confess I've never been to Indonesia, so I don't know much about the culture. And it when you talk to an audience, it's kind of useful to know roughly who you're talking to, what you can take for granted, and I don't have a sense of that. So I'm going to try and keep this as simple as possible. But if I start saying things that you don't understand, then please, stop me, and I'm happy to explain more. So if you have a question, maybe you could contact Fito, and Fito, you can sort of bring people into the conversation,
Sure.
because I I find it impossible on Zoom to read the chat box at the same time as engaging in philosophy. So I'm not going to do that. So if you put comments in the chat box, I won't be reading them. Okay. But if you have questions, then just tell Fito and we'll engage with the questions.
Sure, I can
All
do
right.
that.
Good. Thank you. So um, I think the best thing I can do is give you some historical background. Okay. So first of all, a little bit of terminology. Um, a dilethia is a contradiction that is true. And by contradiction, I mean what logicians mean by contradiction, namely something of the form P and not P. Okay? The word contradiction does get used in many ways, but when I use it today, I'm going to be using it for, P and not P. The sun is shining, the sun is not shining. Donald Trump is corrupt, Donald Trump is not corrupt. All men are mortal, some men are not mortal, that kind of thing. So the word dilethia is a made-up word. I made it up with an old colleague of mine, Richard Sylvan, who's sadly been deceased now for 30 years. But we needed a word to describe this because there wasn't really one in the standard philosophical lexicon. So diletheism is the view that there are some dilethias, that is, that some contradictions are true. Some things of the form P and not P are true. And if you think that the truth of not P is the same as the falsity of P, which is the sort of standard understanding, that's the same as saying some things are true and false. Okay, that's a bit of terminology. Now, as Fito said, dialetheism is a highly unorthodox view in Western philosophy. And the orthodoxy goes back essentially to Aristotle. So at least if you believe Aristotle, there were diletheists around before him, and he tells you who they are: Heraclitus, Protagoras. Whether his history is right, we can argue about, but certainly he took there to be diletheists in ancient Greek philosophy before him. But in the metaphysics, he mounted a defense of the principle of non-contradiction, which says essentially no contradictions are true. They can't even be rationally accepted. Notice that he defended this view in the metaphysics, not in the analytics. So the analytics is where you find Aristotle's logic. Okay, the metaphysics is where you find his metaphysics. So he took the principle of non-contradiction to be a fundamental principle, maybe the fundamental principle of metaphysics. Okay. We don't normally now think of metaphysics as Aristotle did, but the belief in the principle of non-contradiction has been largely retained. Now, an obvious question at this point is how successful were Aristotle's arguments? And we can go into this if you want to. I'm not going to talk about it at great length, but they're pretty awful, the arguments. And this is not just my view. This is the view of modern ancient Greek commentators, or commentators on ancient Greek philosophy. The standard view now is that Aristotle's arguments are not very successful. As I say, we can talk about that more if you want to, but let's leave it there for the moment. Despite the fact that the arguments are so poor, they launched the principle of non-contradiction into orthodoxy in Western philosophy. And as Vitor says, this has been a largely unargued assumption of most Western philosophy. In fact, I'm not sure that there have been any substantial defenses for the principle since Aristotle, until recent times, the last 30 or 40 years. Aristotle's word was taken for granted, even though nearly everything else in Aristotle has been overturned, or at least seriously challenged since Aristotle. Okay, now let me say a little bit more about Western philosophy. Even though the principle of non-contradiction has been high orthodoxy, there have been dissenters. The most obvious of these is Hegel. So some modern Hegel exegetes think that Hegel does endorse the law of non-contradiction. You only got to read the guy to see this is false. He explicitly endorses contradictions in several places in his writings. And again, we can go into Hegel if you want. I don't know how much Hegel interests you, but there are exceptions to the Aristotelian orthodoxy in the history of Western philosophy. They're very few, very, very few. I don't know how much you want to talk about the Asian philosophical traditions. The situation is more nuanced in the Asian traditions. There are certainly plenty of people in the Asian traditions, India, China, who subscribe to the law of non-contradiction. But there hasn't been the same kind of orthodoxy, just because there's never been someone like Aristotle who defended the law in the Asian traditions. I might say that Arabic philosophy is a Western tradition, not an Eastern tradition. It spins off Greek philosophy and comes out of the Middle East, like Christianity and Christian philosophy. So we can talk about Arab philosophy if you want. I suspect it will be very well known in Indonesia, just because after all, it's an Islamic country. But when I'm talking about the Asian traditions, I'm talking about principally India and China. Okay. And as I said, there certainly have been people in the Asian traditions who defended the law, but it hasn't had the same kind of orthodoxy. And there are certainly important thinkers in both the Indian and the Chinese traditions who are quite happy with accepting contradictions. So just as an example, in the Indian context, you find various thinkers in both the Jain tradition and the Buddhist tradition who seem to be quite happy with contradictions. Okay, so the situation in the Asian traditions is not exactly the same as the West. But bottom line of this part of the talk is that, at least in the West, the principle of non-contradiction has been high orthodoxy since Aristotle. Okay. Now, that's metaphysics. And the view that some contradictions are true is a view of metaphysics. It says something about truth, right? You might want to say, well, hey, Graham, what do you mean by truth? Fair question. And the reply is, I don't care. Whatever your favorite view of truth is, I'll work with that. Okay, I don't have a horse in this race. So you can be a correspondence theory, you can be a deflationist, you can be a coherence theory, you can be a pragmatist. I don't care. Whatever you think truth is, dialecticism is the view that some contradictions are true. Okay. Okay. Fita, I see a hand go up from Black Sands.
Oh, it's I think emoji for clapping. I think they like
Oh,
your idea about it.
okay. All right. That sounds good. Okay.
It
Now,
is.
let me turn from metaphysics to logic. Okay, because it's certainly true, as Fito said, that the principle of non-contradiction is orthodox in logic as well as metaphysics nowadays. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the history of logic. And again, I'm going to stick to logic in the West. The East is its own thing. And we can talk about that if you want, but let's just stick to the West. Now, there's this principle which Fito referred to as explosion. Okay, an explosion is that a contradiction will apply everything. It has a Latin medieval name, if you want to sound erudite. It's called ex contradictione quod libet sequitur. Everything follows from a contradiction. All right. Now, the status of this principle is very different from the history of dialecticism, very different. But of course, if that principle is a correct principle of logic, then if dialecticism is true, everything is true. Because if a contradiction is true, everything follows, so everything is true. And there have been a few dialecticists who've argued that everything is true, but this is, my view is that that's crazy. Okay, there's nothing to be said for the view that I'm a frog, for example. So if you're a dialecticist, at least a sane one, that principle of inference cannot hold. All right. And since principle of non-contradiction has been orthodox since Aristotle, you might think that explosion has been orthodox since Aristotle. It hasn't been. Okay. Just a word of terminology again before we go on. Modern logics in which the principle of explosion fails are called paraconsistent. I'll talk to you more about the word if you want to know, but that will do for a definition. So a paraconsistent logic is one where explosion is not a valid principle of inference. And there's been a lot of investigation into paraconsistent logics in the last 50 years. I'll tell you a little bit more about that, but I don't intend to go into too many more details unless you want me to. Okay. So the principle of explosion, what's its history in Western logic? Well, the first thing to know is that it's not classical. It has nothing to do with the great classical Western civilizations of Greece, Rome, Egypt, Persia. Okay. And in fact, you do not find it in any ancient classical texts. You do not find it in Aristotle. Aristotle explicitly denies it. He invented the principle, he invented the logical system called syllogistic. And in the analytics, where he talks about logic, not about metaphysics, he tells us that explosion is not valid. He says that in some moods of syllogisms, contradictions imply some things, but not others. and in some moods it doesn't imply anything. So, strange as this may sound to you, the first system of paraconsistent logic is syllogistic. Has nothing to do with, I mean, even though we call a certain theory of logic classical, this is very different from what actually happened in the classical civilizations. So, all right, so explosion is not to be found in Aristotle. So where does it come from in the history of Western logic? Well, the first occurrences in the text that we know are in medieval Latin philosophy in the 12th century. So at this time, there's a group of philosopher logicians working in Paris. They're called the Pavipontinians. In Latin, Pavipontinian means people who live by a small bridge. Actually, if you go to Paris today, you'll find that small bridge. It's very near Notre Dame Cathedral. So these were philosophers working there. And one of the number of these, who is William of Soissons, was the first person to argue for explosion. Okay, we don't know exactly what argument he used, but I can tell you what we think it is if you're interested. But at least he came up with an argument for explosion. So at least the principle of explosion was known in medieval logic after that time. It's contentious. So medieval logicians love to draw distinctions, and they tend to say, well, in some sense of validity, it's valid, in some sense of validity, it's not valid. And then they argue about the different kinds of validity and when you use what and so on. And there are some people who reject it entirely, depending on the context. So it's a controversial principle in medieval Latin logic. I think it's assumed in medieval Arabic logic. I've not yet found anyone who endorses the principle in medieval Arabic logic, but it's contentious to a certain extent in medieval Latin logic. Okay. Now, if you know anything about the history of Western logic, you'll know in a period of Europe called the Renaissance, medieval logic and a lot of medieval thought fell out of fashion. I mean, it just became forgotten, obscured because of attacks on scholasticism. So all the great advances of Latin medieval logic were forgotten. And the orthodoxy you get after about the 16th, 17th century is again syllogistic. So if you read Kant or Hegel or any of the great philosophers after the scientific revolution, they tend to endorse syllogistic as the correct logical theory, and therefore they do not accept explosion. All right. So where does explosion become orthodox in modern logic? Okay, and it is. It becomes orthodox with the work. Okay, so around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, a new theory of logic is developed. This works, several people involved, but probably the most important figure is the good German logician, mathematician Gottlob Frege. And he invents a system of logic called Begriffsschrift, concept writing. He does this because of his work in the foundations of mathematics, which we can go into if you want to, but let's pass that over for the moment. And he invents a system of logic, which we now call classical logic. Of course, it's been polished by many logicians since, but that's close enough to the truth. The name classical logic is itself interesting because for people like Frege and those who follow him, like Bertrand Russell, this is just logic. It's not classical logic, it's just logic. And the word classical comes later, and it's to do with a debate in the philosophy of mathematics called intuitionism. So I know that Frito mentioned intuitionism. We can talk about that if you want to. But initially, the word classical is a word that arises in the philosophy of mathematics, not logic. And it gets transferred to logic only later. Okay. But in Frege's theory, that is what we now call classical logic, explosion is valid. All right. And so good was so good was Frege's theory that Frege's logic, or at least more modern polished versions of it, soon became orthodox. So by the 1920s, 1930s, if you were in a mathematics department studying logic, you would have read the people who were working on Fregean logic. So people like, you've been taught by people like Hilbert and Tarski and Gens and so on. So this is the logic that you'd have learnt, and it's still the logic that is orthodox. I don't know about Indonesia, you can tell me. But if you take a first course in logic in Europe or any English-speaking country, such as the US or Australia, you will be taught this as kind of the standard theory. That's true. However, classical logic has always had problems, and good logicians know this. There are many, and classical logicians have often addressed some of these issues in an attempt to solve some of these problems. How successful they've been is another matter. We can talk about that if you want. But systems of non-classical logic have been developing in the last 130 years. So the earliest systems of non-classical logic actually go back to the 1910s, 1920s. Intuitionist logic is one of the earliest of these. Okay. So philosophers and logicians, mainly logicians actually, were dissatisfied with classical logic almost from the start. And we, and now I speak as a professional logician, came to the realization that the mathematical techniques that Frege and Russell had used to develop classical logic were actually very, very versatile. So the revolution in logic caused by Frege was caused by the fact that logicians were deploying the tools of mathematics to logic really for the first time. They couldn't really have done it earlier because the appropriate tools were a development of 19th century mathematics. Things like abstract algebra, model theory, and so on. Those are all developments of the 19th century. And people like Frege and Russell were the first logicians really to apply those tools to logic. And they came up applying those tools to classical logic. But we realized that those tools could be applied equally. Model theory, algebraization, those tools could be applied to produce many different logics, and many of them were different from classical logic, and so they're called non-classical logics. And there are many, many non-classical logics now, as you may know. So Fito mentioned my book, Introduction to Non-Classical Logic, which surveys some of the train of non-classical logics. It doesn't cover all the non-classical logics by any means, but it contains many of them. Now, one of these is power-consistent logic. So as I said earlier, power-consistent logic is a logic in which explosion is invalid. And power-consistent logics have been proposed and investigated since the late 1940s. So the earliest paper in modern power-consistent logic was proposed by a Polish logician, Stanisław Jaśkowski, 1948. There's another paper by a Swedish logician in 1949, Søren Halldin. There's important work in Brazil in the 1960s by Newton da Costa. And that's just the beginning. Power-consistent logics of many kinds are now known. And in the early years, the power-consistent logics were developed by people working in isolation. So these people did not know about each other, and they came up with Paraconsistent logics are very different kinds. So, unlike intuitionism, which is one kind of logic, paraconsistent logic is not a single logic. There are many systems of paraconsistent logic. Indeed, virtually any approach to construction of a logical system can be used to produce a paraconsistent logic, whether it's model theory, proof theory, whether it's world semantics, non-world semantics, substructural logics. There are paraconsistent logics of all these kinds. They work on very different levels, and most of them now are very well understood. So as a branch of mathematical logic, paraconsistent logic is very well established. It has its own classification number in the American Mathematics Society classification of mathematical topics, and it's had that since the 1970s, I think. As pure mathematical investigations, paraconsistent logic is not contentious. Of course, whether it's the correct logic for doing things we care about, like reasoning, that's another issue, and that's obviously very philosophically contentious. But the mathematics is not contentious. So now we understand what logics must be like, which accommodate dialetheism. It's got to be a paraconsistent logic. I should add that not all paraconsistent logicians are dialetheists certainly. I mean, most of the paraconsistent logicians I know are not dialetheists. They believe that a paraconsistent logic is right for completely other reasons than dialetheism. We can talk about that if you want to. I'll tell you more if you want to know, but I'm going to pass that over now. Certainly, if you're a dialetheist, you are bound to be a paraconsistent logician. And I think that the modern dialethic movement would not have been possible without developments in formal logic. Because you had to show that contradictions could be kept under control. You do not want contradictions blowing out into areas where you really don't want them. So for example, take the contradiction that I'm a frog and not a frog. It's crazy to suppose that's true. Why? Well, if it's true, then I'm a frog, just by conjunction elimination. And the view that I'm a frog is just plain crazy, okay? So you need to show that contradictions are under control. And that's exactly what paraconsistent logic gives you. So the logical tools are now well understood. Philosophy is much more contentious, as I guess is fairly obvious. So let's go back to philosophy for a moment. Dialecticism is the view that some contradictions are true. It doesn't tell you what contradictions are true. That's another matter. But since the 1970s, some philosophers, including myself and Richard Sylvan, who I mentioned earlier, have been advocating the idea that some contradictions are true. And an obvious question is, well, which ones? Okay, fair question. And there are many possible examples of dialetheses, theories which admit contradictions based on a paraconsistent logic. The one that's got the most space in the literature since the 1970s are the paradoxes of self-reference. So many of you will know exactly what those are. The oldest and simplest and most famous is the lie paradox. This sentence is not true. Reasoning very simply, you can establish that's both true and not true. Okay, so discussions of paradoxes like this have a very long and interesting history. We can talk about that if you like, but let me pass it over now. That's one of the possible applications of dialetheism, which has got a lot of airplay, but there are others. So people have advocated dialethic solutions to Sorites paradoxes. I'll tell you what those are if you don't know. To paradoxes about change and the instant of change, paradoxes about the limits of language, paradoxes now in aesthetics, paradoxes in the debate between idealism and realism in philosophy. So there are many, many possible applications of dialethism. Now, of course, they're all philosophically contentious. And that's understood. I mean, philosophy is contentious. But dialethism as such will not tell you what the good applications are. That's always going to be another matter. And there are many debates about that are currently in the Western philosophical literature and increasingly the Eastern philosophical literature as well. I've nearly finished this introduction. Let me end with a final thought. Dialethism does not tell you what contradictions are true. That's a matter for separate investigation. What it tells you is that if you have a contradictory theory, then you can't write it off for a priori reasons. So the effect of dialethism as a kind of modern philosophical movement is to broaden the ambit of philosophical theorizing. So when we theorize about anything in science, in philosophy, in ethics, in metaphysics, in logic, we're always going to have a bunch of different theories on the table. Because, these topics are contentious. And in any topic of a theoretical investigation, there are always many different theories. Until the present time, with a few exceptions like Hegel, the theories have always been consistent theories because inconsistency has been off the table. So we're looking to choose a theory from this consistent bunch, which is the best theory. So we deploy the criteria of theory choice to do that. Again, we can talk about that if you want, but let me pass over that. What dialethism does is say, hey, yeah, I mean, if you're having a theoretical investigation of something, then yeah, there are going to be these consistent theories which are on the table. But now there are going to be more theories, and some of them are going to be inconsistent, and they are going to be based on a paraconsistent logic. So now we've got more theories to choose from. So it's broadened our ambit of philosophical theorization. And it may well be that an inconsistent theory actually turns out to be the best in the end. Whether this is so is always going to be a contentious matter, I think. But I mean, just consider one standard example, theories of truth. So theories of truth are well known to involve you in things like the liar paradox. Theories of truth are everywhere in the history of Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy. And it's always assumed, or nearly always been assumed, that truth is consistent. But now we know what inconsistent theories of truth are like. We now have theories of truth which are based on a paraconsistent logic that admit the lie paradox and then control the contradictions. So it could well be the case, in fact, I think it is the case, that when it comes to truth, the best theory on the table is actually an inconsistent one. And so it could be for other things too, like Socrates' paradoxes, motion, the limits of thought. These things are all currently explored in the philosophical literature in the West. So they're always going to be contentious because this is philosophy. But the point I'm making here is that the ultimate importance of I think, of dialethism on the philosophical scene is that it broadens our scope of philosophical theorization by putting theories on the table, which were off the table before. That doesn't mean that if you're theorizing about something, an inconsistent theory is going to be best. Quite possibly, quite likely, the best theory is going to be a consistent theory. But that's not now a priori necessary. And it could well be that in some cases, for example, the theory of truth, an inconsistent theory is the best theory. Now, we have only just begun to explore what you might be able to do with inconsistent theories. As I've indicated, inconsistent theories about some things are on the table, but frankly, we've only just begun to explore this. I think Fito mentioned the title transconsistent. That's okay. I mean, that's a word that I coined a long time ago, and it never really got taken up. Dialethism has become much more standard. But transconsistent is obviously when you go beyond the consistent and you look at inconsistent possibilities. So I coined that word by analogy with the mathematical word transfinite, which is a word coined by the great German mathematician Georg Cantor. And the transfinite was the landscape we find ourselves in when you go beyond the finite. Transconsistent is the landscape you find yourself in when you go beyond the consistent. And I think we are now just beginning to explore the transconsistent, the landscape beyond the consistent. Where it will take us, who knows? It may fizzle out like so many philosophical ideas. It's entirely possible. I'm not going to predict the future. I don't think it will. I hope it won't. And what philosophical possibilities that it lays before us, I think that is something we're only just beginning to investigate. And I think that this is going to be the basis of many very interesting, maybe many profound philosophical investigations in the next, well, however long philosophy lasts. We will see. I won't be around long enough to find out. Most of you guys look as though you're younger than I am, so you will know more about this than I do in 50 years' time. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Chris, for that, I think, for that rich and thought-provoking presentation. And also, you left a lot of points that maybe we can explore in our next session. So thank you for insightful and then illuminating and easy to follow presentation. So yeah, to open up the conversation further, we will now hear a response from Ahnaf, who will engage with the presentation and offer his perspective. So yeah, maybe like who will offer his reflection and critical remarks on the ideas we have just heard. So, Mas Ahnaf, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you, Fito, for the time, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And first off, I would like to thank Ubermensch and Intuinistic ID and all of our media partners like Logos Logis, Hermeneuta, Sosfax, Filsafat Rindu, Ruang Filsafat, and Logos ID. And most importantly, thank you, Professor Priest. It's an honor to meet you, the Prince of Darkness. I'm Muhammad Qadr Ahnaf, and you can call me Ahnaf. And I
Yeah, and
graduate a master degree in.
okay, please call me Graham. That's fine.
Oh, okay, okay. Thank you, Graham. Um, I'm graduate a master degree in University of Gajah Mada, master of philosophy. And yeah, on a side note, intrinsic ID is basically taking inspiration from the Logician Liberation League. And since Indonesia obviously lacks logicians, because there are snakes of the philosophical power structure in Indonesia, which have been created and established, and which maintain to put down the logician or Indonesian logician. Logic is not even a subject in the Indonesian school system, even if it is paradoxically exists in the test. And journalistic idea try to popularize formal logic and analytic philosophy so that the public might aware that logic does not end in Aristotle, and philosophy is not merely for thinking about only about the meaning of life. And that was the basics. And for your worry about the audience doesn't understand, it's you don't have to worry, Graham, because interesting idea have wrote some writings about your ideas too, about the very consistent logic and about deletheisms, and some of us, I think, would understand about your ideas even on the basic level. And yeah, basically, you are my hero, and I'm pretty nervous here, basically, and to talk
Don't
about
worry.
your ideas, Graham. And I don't know. I believe that your ideas is not just a collection of different things. Is The more I read about your works, limit of thoughts, doubt to be a liar, doubt truth to be doubt to be a liar, and in contradictions, and of course non-classical logic, introduction to non-classical logic. Yeah, I think it's very connected and it's stunningly systematic for me. No, what do I call it? It's a architecture of contradictions, possibly, and like any great buildings, and we can take an analogy from a building. Like I think it's powerful ideas that load bearing foundations, and one of that foundations is what you said is deletheisms. And yes, in simple terms, it was that there is some contradictions, and I mean that some contradictions are true, and yeah, like what you said before, like historically, we or maybe all of us haven't think, or a human basically haven't think about there's no such thing as contradictions, in a sense that since Aristotle, from Aristotle and onwards, to Islam, and then is they are probably thinking that there's no such thing as contradictions because they take the non-contradictions as the absolute law, and a statement or a propositions cannot be both true and false at the same time. And yes, saying the term about classical logics is pretty new, but we can refer them as a classical logic or a classical view, to make it easy. And the classical view says that basically because they are bivalent and truth preservations. So when there are contradictions such as A and not A, the system will explode because is basically a truth preservations. So truth preservations means if all the premises is true, the conclusion is also true. If all the premises is true and the conclusion is true, because the premises is not true or cannot be true because it's contradictions, then for any B the conclusions, it follows, and that what we call an explodes. It explodes that we can conclude anything, like you said before. mm, I'm frog and I'm not a frog at the same time. Therefore, I can fly. For example, is it's pretty much unintuitive, but that's the principle of explosion, basically. And logically, we can prove anything from it, and that's why uh, anything can be true is a trivialism, right? And this trivialism is, I, as long as I read about you, is you are trying to reject trivialisms, and maybe you
Well,
call it as what is it? Certified insanity, I think. If I remember it correctly, you say that trivialism is certified insanity, and yeah,
you're right.
yeah, and that's why the consistency is you bring. I mean, not that you bring, because historically is has been established before you came, but um, the consistent logic tries to mitigate these explosions that from a contradictions we're not going to conclude everything, maybe something, but not everything, and we can just stop and thinking about it again. And that's makes me, oh, this is a good idea. I mean, the story is like this. Well, why you are my heroes, basically. Let me tell some stories about me. Um, I'm undergraduates. I met some lecturers that he in class is basically going to agree with everything that the student says. And when I met that reality, I mean that phenomena, what is this lecturer thinking? For example, like from a student A and student B, the student A says X, and the student B says negative X, or no, not X. Um, the lecturer would agree with both of them with their own reason. For example, like A says X because of something, and then B would say, "No, it's not that. It's because blah blah blah." And then the lecturer would say, "Yeah, that's what is true." I'm I'm in classes like, what is inside of this lecturer's head? I don't even understand what he's trying to convey. And then I'm like graduating and knowing nothing. Knowing something, not. Uh, yeah, like you said, knowing something in the sense that philosophy is basically is just something that contradicts story to one another and keep debating and contentious. And then my friend introduced me to your book of non-classical logic. I love logic since I was high school, but I was just knowing about the classical logics before I met your book, and then I read about your book, and then, oh, this is a Grand Prix, and then read about your another book, and so on. And yeah, that's basically now it changes my ideas about. Now I understand that reality is maybe a contradictory, and maybe myself when I have an opinion about something, and maybe I might be contradictory someday, or uh, I'm feeling like I'm probably more humble in your because of you and your concepts. And anyway, but talking about trivialisms, and you are trying to reject it, and then uh, these rejections is what's when I say per consistent logic, and then you have this kind of system that is called logic of paradox, in which there are three values instead of two, like classical there's two. And then logic of paradox have three: true, false, and both. And I interpret both here as a dialetheisms. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think because when obviously is explosion is not valid, right? Because A and then not A concludes B, we can input B to A and not A, because not A and A is both a designated value that is both. So the conclusion might be false. Therefore, we cannot conclude. And I think because this is one of example of the true contradictions, in a way that uh, it is possible that uh, contradic- the contradictory premises to be true. Therefore, uh, uh, there is a counterexample in which the premises all true and the conclusions is false. That's why the or sorry, or designated value. I'm sorry, because it's the same as true on validity. And then we can say this is a kind of, I think, kind of dialetheism in technically speaking. And that is kind of I think they're uh, explaining the paraconsistent logic in a very simplistic way, not very technically speaking, right? Not very. too technical. We're just adding new truth value, and that's it. Have a very consistent logic. And yes, and when you said that, Graham, that you said, how about the contradictions that it is some, but specifically what? I thought that um, it is specific, like the paradox itself is the instances of the true contradiction. I thought before like that. When that's why I'm a little bit confused when you said that um, Diotheism is some said that some contradiction is true, and I thought the one of that instantiation is the paradox itself. But when you say this is just another matter, maybe you can clarify it later. But yeah, I think the paradoxes itself, the existence of the paradox as a liar paradox, for example, is the instantiation of the dialetheia as something that is contradictory and that is true. Of course, it's not in reality. I mean, like in the actual world, but it's in the propositions. But I think it's also some kind of existence. Is the fact that there is a contradictory propositions. It's true that this is contradictory. That's something like that. And yeah, I think it captures a beautiful way because um, uh, in one solutions maybe uh, intuitionistic or or paracomplete approach is not does not have a maybe have a revenge paradox, and another have another revenge paradox like this statement is false and then is this statement is not true, but the dialectic solutions is pretty much simple. Just yeah, we just accept that even if some people might say, hey, we must reject the contradiction, why you accept it? It's like accepting accepting the bug as a feature, right, in its programming settings. But I think it's pretty straightforward in the sense that when we have some kind of assumption like a liar propositions or stuffs, and we can conclude that it's paradox, why don't we just conclude that that is paradox is pretty much simple. I mean, your solution is pretty much simple. But I have some question about it, but I will ask you later. And then you have the enclosure schema, and then you also have a principle of uniform solutions that I really love it. I mean, enclosure schema aims to capture the liar paradox perfectly, in my opinion. And then the principle of uniform solution is pretty much intuitive in a sense that if like I think is this is your analogy, like if there are two people is sick and these two people having the same kind of sickness, then we must treat them equally. I mean, we have the same solution for both in a uniform way, and in the sense that we are attacking the cause of the sickness the same way, not treating them differently. I mean, it was intuitive for me. And then from that, I think we can move on to your handle contradictions and then applying to another, probably like your concept of nonaism, because I think it's from dialetheisms and then to per consistent and then going to the nonaisms from the metaphysics, where why we can think about the object that does not exist, like this is about like building block of it, because it's not existing, then we can uh, predicate something or encode, for example, a code some properties to them, and maybe they are contradictory, and it works flawlessly. And it is and it is possible because it's dilettairisms, and we are just going to commit about the coherency of something, not about its consistency. Like we may be inconsistent, but at least we are coherent from concluding that it is inconsistent, and that's I think something that really changed my mind about seeing metaphysics, and then yeah, how it relates, how you relate it to the Chatuscoti and Nagarjuna, and then how you try to explain the what's it called, the four possibility, right? Like it's true, false, or FDE, yeah, first degree entailment. Um, uh, uh, but I think FDE entailment is a first degree entailment is just combinations of apparent consistent and apparent complete, because there is neither and both in our system. And yeah, uh, I think I'm sorry. I think I remember there one in your book, uh, five corners. I think, yeah, about the value E, ineffable, and when there is something truth value where we can spoke about it, and then you said about the pluri, where a proposition have many value. I'm sorry, I little bit forget about it. Plurivalent logic. Yes, plurivalent logic where something if ineffable is true, that is ineffable, but is ineffable. Yeah, and yeah, it's pretty interesting. I just read it one, not reading it religiously, but I've just read it. But yeah, and I what I like about you also is your answer about some of your criticism. I think I remember that, for example, I think some of your critics says that you are changing the subjects, but I would agree about that. You say that the underlying point uh, is offering the new meaning, or offering the stronger theory about the negations, like because we are saying that A is B if and only if, and negative A is also B, the value of it. And then when the critic says it's changing the subjects, well, it is the point. Like the point is the offering the better options or more powerful solutions about or powerful concepts about the negations. And I think yes, the negations is probably uh negation of deletheia is also deletheia, because it's inherently paradoxical. And about the exclusion problem, I think, and you say, how about when the other theist wants to disagree and you are trying to separate? Uh, I think it's doubt truth to be a liar. The book is, and yeah, trying to separate it from the negations and denials, and to negate is just a logical word, the simple negations, or word not. And someone might accept A and negative and not A at the same time, but one cannot accepts and rejects A at the same time. And so one cannot agree and disagree at the same time, but one can agree to A and negative A, and not A, and negation of A. And a deletheist, it shows that deletheist might be empathically uh, denies that everything is true, because uh, they can reject some statements, not not just, so that's why deletheia is not necessarily accepting everything as a deletheia, and disagreement is safe, and from there is pretty much uh, complete, I guess. And yeah, I think um, the foundational move here is that you are basically taking contradictions seriously from your work, and this when the new logic is built, and the paradoxes and can be solved by accepting it, and then with that solutions and new metaphysics is reformed. And that's why I think uh, you have a big ideas here that you are built from the start, starting from the diatheisms. And my first question, maybe start with two. My first question is, what's so problematic about trivialisms? And I remember, yeah, like what I said before, like you are saying, um, like trivialism is certified society. What is so problematic about trivialism in society? That's the first question. And then the second questions, I see an evolutions of your former tools. Like you're starting with tree valued LP, and then you're finally in the five valued, and even accepts the plurivalent logics. And then, as we can see, that per consistent logic is not one logic like intuitionistic logic, but is umbrella terms about the many term, about the many or many system and many logical systems that rejects principle of explosion. But do you see that? Is there any a final or most correct logic within the consistent logic, or you see it consistent logic is as maybe powerful than the other, but the umbrella term itself, there's a toolbox inside it, but it must be a consistent logic. Maybe that's two questions that I want to ask you, Graham.
Okay, so let me take them in reverse order. LP is a very simple paraconsistent logic, okay? But I've never suggested that it's okay on its own. I mean, it has no conditional for a start. So it's at best the sort of core of a good logic. And you can augment it with all kinds of things, conditionals, operators, and so on. And I think that's the right way to go. What you need to augment it with to deal with certain problems, that's always going to be an open question. I mean, do you want gaps as well as gluts? Maybe. I think these are interesting and open questions. I wouldn't foreclose them. What you said raises the question of logical monism versus logical pluralism. I mean, is there one correct logic or is there not? I guess I'm a logical monist. I think in the end there is one correct system of logic, and I tend to have orthodoxy on my side as far as the history of logic goes, because logical pluralism is a very new view. And I think there is some arguments for it. I don't find them very plausible. But in the end, you know, if there's more than one correct logic, then I'm cool with that. All I would insist is that for some applications, you know, you need a paraconsistent logic, and that's correct. Okay, so that's the second question. The first question was about what's wrong with contradictions. Okay. All right.
I'm sorry, about trivialisms. I'm sorry.
Oh, what's wrong with trivialism?
Yeah, what was the problem with
Oh,
trivialisms? Like your seems to against trivialisms.
yeah. Okay. No, that's a fair question. Look, there in Doubt, Truth to Be a Liar, there are a couple of essays that address that. But let me give you a simple answer. Look, if trivialism is true, then I'm a frog. Now that's just crazy, okay? What is the evidence that I'm a frog? It's very hard to think of any, right? Now, we're in the domain of discussions of rationality here. When is it rational to believe something? Okay, that's a central question in philosophy. It's a tough question. But I think that the great Scottish philosopher David Hume got it roughly right when he said the wise person apportions their beliefs according to the evidence. So if the evidence points in favor of something, you should believe it. If the evidence doesn't point in favor, then you shouldn't. To believe it is just, well, gullible. You shouldn't believe that for which there is no evidence. Okay, what is the evidence for me being a frog? There isn't any. It's irrational to believe that I'm a frog. So a fortiori, it's irrational to believe that everything is true because that entails that I'm a frog. So that's a simple and quick answer to your question.
Okay, but like this, I mean, but how? Maybe let's try to accommodate the friends, our friends, that is, because some of our friends that is continental here, like how does it feels like to accept contradictions? I mean, phenomenologically speaking, or is this dialetheism is just to complete the system of the logic? I mean the logical system trying to solve the liar paradox, or there is some consequences in how we think about something in dialectic speaking, in
Yeah.
dialectic perspective.
Okay, so what does it feel like to endorse contradictions? It feels like being me.
Okay.
Uh, so um,
Uh, like
diatheism is,
being okay, go on.
no, no, go on.
No, I want to know your opinion about it more.
Well, dialectics is not there just to round out the system of philosophy. I mean, dialecticism says that some things really are contradictory. If you want to understand them, you need a theory which is itself inconsistent. And what you do when you investigate a problem is come up with different theories, and then you choose the best. And if the best theory that we have at the moment is inconsistent, so be it. You believe it. I don't think there's anything puzzling about this. Look, let me just say that you said that when we hit a contradiction, we reject it. Okay. Now, whenever someone uses the word we, I always say, who's we? Because often people think that it's sort of me and my friends, and everybody behaves like us. And that's almost certainly false about everything. Now, who rejects contradictions out of hand? Well, they tend to be Western philosophers. But philosophers are a strange bunch. You know, they have a particular history, particular training. Now, there's experimental work on this, which you may or may not know. But there's a branch of philosophy or philosophical investigations nowadays called XFI. I don't know if that's known in Indonesia, but it stands for experimental philosophy. And in experimental philosophy, philosophers or psychologists or whatever actually go around and they ask people their views about various philosophical issues. Okay, it's a well-established branch of philosophy nowadays. And there are XFI studies on the principle of non-contradiction. I can give you some references if you want to know. And it turns out that most people are actually quite happy to endorse contradictions sometimes. So a standard example concerns vague transitions. So let's suppose it's been raining heavily, right? Let's suppose the rain slowly stops and eventually stops. No, there's this kind of middle period when it's sort of, well, has it not?
The cutoff point, right?
It's a kind of borderline case,
Yeah.
right? And XFI studies about these borderline cases. have established that many people, when they're asked about this, no, they're not philosophers, they're just ordinary people, are quite happy to say that it's both raining and not raining. Actually, they're happy to say that it's both raining and not raining, and that it's neither raining nor not raining. They're happy to endorse these views, both of them. So a lot of people are quite happy to endorse contradictions on some things sometimes. So, you know, this we of you must reject a contradiction out of hands does not apply to many people. Now, I mean, to what extent is this culturally relative? I mean, if you did these experiments in Indonesia, would you get different answers? I don't know. But these experiments were these surveys were carried out mainly in English-speaking countries. So maybe they're culturally relative, maybe they're not, I don't know, but certainly they discovered interesting things about sort of people who operate in an English-speaking context.
Okay. And talk about the contradiction again. There's something interesting in LP. Yeah, it's very basic, as you said, but that's one of the example. But I think when I'm seeing that this basic example itself, when we try to capture the notion of dialetheic or dialetheisms, it's pretty much interesting. Like there is some paradox there. I mean, the name is logic of paradox, but it's inherently paradoxical in the sense that the law of non-contradictions is valid, and
So is
when
its
I
negation.
yeah, so is
Yes.
the negations, and how is there any other systems that maybe showing off that law of non-contradictions is not valid, um, rendering like dialetheism says, or against the law of non-contradictions? Because I thought
Yeah.
intuitively to against the something, because if Aristotle says this is a law of non-contradiction, so it's valid, but to against it, you should render it invalid. Is there any system?
Yeah.
Because
Oh, absolutely. So what we're calling the law of non-contradiction here is a logical truth of the form, it's not the case that A and not A, right?
yes,
And there are plenty of there are well-known power consistent logics in which that's not a logical truth. So some of the systems invented by the Brazilian logician Newton da Costa are like this.
hmm,
Uh, Actually, what we're now seeing in the last 4 or 5 years is an investigation of logical systems. They don't yet have a standard name, but I'm inclined to call them uber consistent logics. And uber consistent logics are power consistent logics of a very special kind. They actually have inconsistent logical truths. So LP doesn't. The logical truths of LP are actually consistent. I mean, although, you know, there are theories in which A and not A is true, even though it's not the case that A and not A is a logical truth. But now we're seeing a study of uber consistent logics where the logical truths themselves are actually inconsistent. So this is a relatively new investigation, but there are plenty of logics of this kind which are well known. So you can certainly have a logical theory in which the logical truths are explicitly contradictory. We know those. I'm not telling you they're right,
because
but they're known.
okay, because like for example, clean tree-valued clean is obviously renders law of non-contradictions as invalid,
Yes.
but it's not very consistent. I mean,
Yes.
can we call a clean tree-valued logic dialetheic logic? Because
No.
it oh, okay.
No. Look, there is a question of how exactly you formulate the law of non-contradiction, right? and it's not as straightforward as it might appear. But probably the most sort of general understanding of the law of non-contradiction is that you can't accept contradictions. And if that's what you mean by the law of non-contradictions, then strong cleanly is not congenial to paraconsistency just because it validates explosion. So explosion, when a push comes to shove, as the English say, it's really explosion which rules out contradictions. It's not the principle, it's not the case that A and not A, because you can have contradictions. Even about that, what really rules out explosion, what really rules out contradictions is explosion, which says the system collapses into triviality if you have a contradiction. So I think probably in the end, that's the best way of thinking about the principle of non-contradiction.
Okay. So, like, maybe we can think of it like in LP, that is there is um, inherently contradictory in the law of non-contradiction itself,
Sure,
like that.
sure, sure.
Okay, that's pretty much. I mean, struck me. And what time is now? 9:27. Yeah, I have a last questions, and after that we can go to Vito and maybe take the people to questions. And my last questions is about your principles. And you have principles of uniform solutions. And when I read your writings about curious paradox, and yeah, I think prior have shown that there are general structure within curious paradox and liar paradox or Russell's paradox, and your solutions is trying to solve it or resolve it uniformly qua examples of generalized curious paradox by rejecting, of course, uh, expaxual codebed and contraction. And my question is, why don't you resolve it via generalized principles? Because uh, the structure within the explosion and modus ponens is having the same structure, right? And why don't you reject just by rejecting explosion and modus ponens at the same time? You can just solve curious paradox and light paradox.
Yeah. Okay. Basically, the first thing is you cannot do this. Carrier's paradox involves conditionals, right? Now, you're quite right that in LP, the conditional does not detach. And if you think that the conditional does not detach, then that does solve Carrier's paradox. That's quite right. But there are many different conditionals, and presumably there must be some notion of conditionality which satisfies modus ponens. If there isn't, it's very hard to do any kind of reasoning without modus ponens. So at least some notion of conditionality must satisfy modus ponens. And you can formulate a Carrier paradox using that notion of conditionality. And then dialethism is of no help, because if you've got modus ponens and one other principle of conditionality, namely contraction, then you've got Carrier's paradox. So that's why just sticking to LP isn't going to solve the problem for you.
Okay, so basically, I'm sorry, I'm trying to, um, uh, so what you're saying is that modus ponens, we need modus ponens more than the contraction. principles, or?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think that a good solution to Carey's paradox will reject the notion of a contraction for any decent conditional. Yeah.
Okay, so okay, I have one more questions, but it's 9:30. Yeah, can come back
Yeah.
to Vito, and thank you, Graham, for the amazing answers.
Thank you for your thoughts.
My
Okay.
pleasure.
Are you done, Anna?
Yeah, I'm done, and we can go to the questions. There is some questions here, I
Sure.
think, right?
Okay. So yeah,
Uh,
but first I want
I'm
to
not
say
that
thank you
greedy,
for
bro. I could ask my questions here, but
yeah,
yeah, let
yeah.
the public want to ask.
Yep, maybe we could, yeah, jump to the question first. So, but first, let me say thank you for Arnab, yeah, for the interesting reflection, and thank you both for that discussion. I think it's a wonderful discussion. Especially for me, it's a thought-provoking discussion. That's why I think I would like open the floor to the questions from the audience. Wait, my little question to Professor Prince. Okay.
Hey, please call me Graham.
Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, so I would like to ask you, Graham, about I think like how do we perceive reality, or to be more specific about ontological implication of transconsistency or dialectism or paraconsistence. If some contradiction are true, Uh, I would like to know, like, does this mean there are contradictory states of affairs in reality? Do we countenance, or do we countenance the existence of inconsistent objects or situations? Because I think it's so interesting for me. It seems like a bold ontological claim. That's why I'm interested in these questions. So maybe you could explore that topics a
Yeah.
little bit for me. Thank you.
Okay. So look, the first question is, what do you mean by contradictions in reality? What do you mean by states of affairs? Now, in one sense, if dialectism is true, there are inconsistent states of affairs. So let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, that the liar paradox is both true and not true. Well, that's a state of affairs, and that's a contradiction. I mean, so that's a very simple way of answering the question, but it's not very exciting. What's moving you is not that sort of very flat-footed thought. What's moving you is the connection between what is true and reality. Okay. Now, of course, that's a big question. And it takes us back to something I said earlier, to the effect that you might ask me, what do you mean by true? And I said, I don't care. I mean, I don't really have any fixed view on that. But if you think that truth is some kind of correspondence theory, so that true statements are those which correspond in some sense to contradictory facts, so this is sort of, if you like, the Wittgenstein's Tractatus, then yes, there are going to be contradictory facts. Okay. And we know what those are like, because there are theories of facts according to which, you can have contradictory facts. So the work of, say, Barwise and Etchemendy on facts accommodate the possibility that they're inconsistent facts. So we know what that's like. Now, it doesn't mean you've got to be a realist. You might not be a realist, okay? You might be a deflationist about truth. There's nothing more to truth than the T-schema. That's essentially what deflationism is. You might be a pragmatist. You might be a coherence theorist. So the bottom line of the answer to your question is what dialethism tells you about reality depends on your view of the connection between what is true and reality. And I don't have a very fixed view on that. I'm happy to leave that to people who do.
Okay, are you done with your answer?
Can I add? Can I add more questions, follow-up questions?
It's
Oh,
So what's your opinion about, for example, like truth maker semantics, for example, and its relations to like relating the truth into its state of affair by introducing the truth making relations
Yeah.
between the reality and
Yeah.
the proposition truth bearer.
Okay. So truth maker theory is a contemporary form of realism. And I know a lot of work has gone into that. I've never thought a great deal about it, but it's a nice idea. And if you think that some contradictions are true, and if you think that every truth has a truth maker, then of course there have got to be contradictory truth makers, at least in the sense that states of affairs which make a contradiction true. Okay. My understanding of truth maker semantics is that this is quite compatible with truth maker semantics. If I remember right, Kit Fine, for example, who's done a lot of the moving on this, admits the possibility of truth makers, inconsistent truth makers which make contradictions true. He just doesn't think there are any, but they're in his machinery. So again, we understand what such a theory will be like.
Okay, thank you.
okay. That's all, Ahmad. Do you have any response to that answer?
Yeah, well, maybe next.
Okay. Maybe we could jump to the audience questions. Okay, first, I would like to read the questions for you, Graham. So there is a question in the chat box that says, what are the concrete implications of paradoxical or transconsistent logic for classical mathematics? Could it affect proof, theorems, or structures, or is it in fact primarily philosophical?
Right. So this is a question about the foundations of mathematics. Okay, that's fine. It's important. It used to be assumed or thought that there's only one kind of mathematics. This was the mathematics that was known at the end of the 19th century. It's what Frege was trying to explain. And of course, the study of that kind of mathematics has gone a long way in the 20th century. And in the big foundational programs of mathematics in the 20th century, it was assumed that there was a unified notion of mathematics for which we were looking for a kind of an uber foundation, an uber theory which captures it all. And for a while, it was thought to be Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory. I'm not sure that that view still holds much water, but anyway, what we now know is that there are systems of mathematics which are based on classical logic, sure. But we also know that there are systems of mathematics which are based on non-classical logics. And that idea goes back to the beginning of the 20th century with the work on intuitionist mathematics. So we know that perfectly good, perfectly interesting mathematical structures which are based on intuitionistic logic. And you don't have to be an intuitionist to think that. You just have to be able to recognize interesting mathematics. So there are mathematical structures based on intuitionistic logic. We know now that there are mathematical structures based on paraconsistent logics, obviously set theories, but also topologies, systems of linear equations, and so on. So I'm not a sort of pluralist about logic, but I'm a pluralist about mathematics. So you can have a mathematical structure based on any logic you like. I think some of them may be more interesting than others or whatever, but mathematical structures have what you might call an internal logic. And when you study them, you have to use the internal logic of the structure. So I think the great foundational programs of the 20th century are now past. I think we're in a situation where we just have an irremediable plurality of pure mathematics. When it comes to applied mathematics, it's an entirely different story. I'm talking about pure mathematics. So I think mathematicians can study pure mathematical structures with any internal logic. And I wrote a short book, came out a year or two ago, called Mathematical Pluralism, where I spell this idea out in more detail.
Okay, thank you for your answer. So maybe I think that's already eliminating the answer. So maybe we could move to the next question. So there is a two question in the chat box. So the next question is there a unique formulation like formalization of dialectism in metaphysics term or the logics of paradox in analytic terms? Like principle of identity, principle of contradiction, and the third one, principle of excluded middle. How about the dialectism, accepting a statement A and rejecting that statement are not the same as the statement A and its negation A. Rejecting A is not the same as accepting negation A. Therefore, there can be a genuine contradiction only when both accept A and accept negation A. So his simple question is basically like how to formalize the claim that accepting negation A is not the same as rejecting A.
Okay. Let me set rejection aside for a moment and come back to that. If you formulate dialectism in logical terms, it depends what logical machinery you want to use. So the most straightforward way of formulating dialectism is to use propositional quantification, okay? Where you can quantify the propositional parameters. Then you can formalize dialectism simply as for some P and not P. That's the most straightforward way of doing it. Now, you might not like propositional quantifiers. If you don't want to use that, then you really need a truth predicate. Okay. Truth predicate is not normally thought of as logical machinery. It's thought of as, truth is not normally thought of as a logical constant. I actually think there are very good reasons for thinking of it as a logical constant. But set that matter aside. We can come back to that if you want. If you have got a truth predicate at your disposal, then you can formulate dialectism by the sentence, there is an X such that X is true and its negation is true. Okay, you've got to explain how you do that quite, because you're using negation inside quotations. So there's an issue there that needs to be addressed, but that's kind of standard. So dialectism will be expressed using the truth predicate as for some X, X is true and its negation is true. Okay, now come back to this question about denial, rejection. Denial and rejection are not logical notions, they're speech act notions. So speech act theory says that when we utter things, our utterances can have different forces. Okay, and this is not contentious. You can say one thing and it can be a question, a command, an assertion. So for example, if I say, the door's open, I utter that sentence. Now, depending on the context, that could be an assertion, telling someone about the state of the door. It could be a question, door's open, please close it. It could be a command, the door's open, meaning go and close it. So the sentence is the same. It's just that the force, the speech act force is different. Now, denial is a speech act, a kind of speech act force. And following Frege, it was common at one time to think that it's not a sui generis speech act, because to deny P is simply to assert not P. That was Frege's view. I think this view is wrong, and I think most people now think that's wrong. I certainly do. But whatever the case about that, then it's a notion of speech act force, and that's not a logical notion. Speech acts, there's no standard way of reducing speech act theory to formal logic, because it's to do with the use of sentences, not the content of sentences. So if you're looking for a kind of logical formalization which involves denial or rejection, you're not going to get that with any standard technology. I don't know if that answers the problem, the question.
I think it could be the answer. So, yep. So maybe we could jump to another questions. So I would like to give an opportunity from one of my friends in here who already raised his hand. So could you open your mic first, Rahmanda Aquila Arcano?
Yeah, thank you, Vito, for the and maybe let me introduce myself. Like, yeah, my name is Akil. And I'm a student philosophy from Universitas Gadjah Mada too, and I'm part of Indigenistic ID. And maybe my question is simple, Graham. Uh, this it's a little bit techniques, like yeah, technical. Like, is is it a good deal or great deals to accept like a paradox and all logic of paradox and reject the disjunctive syllogism, I guess, because uh, as long as I remember, like the logic paradox can do modus ponens or disjunctive syllogism, and if you want to do that, you need to reformulate it as a Rothley Mayer, I guess, if I yeah if I was right. And yeah, it's a great deal because disjunctive syllogism and modus ponens, if you reject it, it's just like I don't know, I cannot accept that philosophically. And maybe next question is about your view about non-existent object. and and I yeah and I think how you see the nonism, I guess, nonism, because I think you learn a lot about Eastern tradition about contradiction, and or even not existent object as a contradictory object, like that, like something ineffable from nothingness. And yeah, something like that is uh how you feel about that, and how you feel about the simplicity, the argument about that opposite to Maynonian, and yeah, something like the existence, or there is something that not exists.
Okay.
And maybe like that. And maybe the next question is about impossible world. Why that
Okay.
that
Well,
that
hold it there.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
let me answer those two questions, and then you can ask the next question. Okay, otherwise I'll get confused. All right. So first of all, the first question was about conditionals. Now, you're right that if you define the material conditional in LP, it doesn't detach. Modus ponens for the material conditional is not valid. Okay. It seems to me fairly obvious that if you're going to do any substantial reasoning, you need some kind of conditional which detaches. So LP can only be the core of a theory. It's got to be augmented by various other machinery, such as modal operators, but one of those extra bits of machinery is a conditional. So you need to add a detachable conditional to the machinery of LP. And there are many ways you can do that. But one very natural way is to add the conditional of a relevant logic. And these are logics which have the sort of most common semantics of relevant logics is Rattler-Meyer semantics, as you said. So you can incorporate the semantics of LP in a Rattler-Meyer semantics. And you need to do at least something like that if you want to have a detachable conditional. And I think that's exactly what you should do. Okay. That was the first question. Second question is a bit more complicated. It's about nonism. That's actually, let me just say, that's how you pronounce the word. It's like the English word none, as in, I'll have none of it. And you just stick ism on the end. Okay. So it's nonism. Nonism is the view that some things don't exist. That view is entirely consistent. Where it starts to get more interesting is when you start to argue or worry about the properties of non-existent objects. I mean, some of us think that existent objects are inconsistent. I do. But set that issue aside. Suppose there are non-existent objects, then can those be inconsistent? Well, look, this is something that can be debatable, but I don't think that non-existent objects are inconsistent. Let me give you an example to explain why. Take most people's favorite examples of non-existent objects, fictional objects, like Anna Karenina or Sherlock Holmes, or some fictional object. No, there are inconsistent fictions. I know because I wrote one. It's called Sylvan's Box, in which there's an impossible object, which is both full and empty. It contains something and it doesn't. Now, let's just call this box Sylvan's Box. So in this story, Sylvan's Box is an inconsistent object. That doesn't mean that in reality, the box is inconsistent. It just means that in the story, there's an inconsistent object. And truth in a story is not truth. Okay. So, for example, if you take the Conan Doyle stories about Sherlock Holmes, it's true that there's a detective that lives in a street in London called Baker Street. Now, that's true in the story, but it's not really true. Baker Street has never had a detective living in it. So truth in a story and truth are different things. So the mere fact that some fictional objects can be true in their stories doesn't mean that they're literally, the fact that things have properties in a story does not mean they really have them. So the fact that Sylvan's Box has contradictory properties in the story doesn't imply that it really has contradictory properties. So nonism as such, not even the theory of nonist fictional objects tells you that reality is actually consistent. That's a different matter. And I don't think that nonism implies dialethism. Does that answer your second question?
It's about impossible world and relevant logic, because I think I don't know what your opinion about relevant logic, but in my opinion, the semantic of relevant logic is somehow weird for me. Like it, you know, they need like Rothley star or the impossible world semantics, I guess. And after it, you need to talk about what is world, like what's ternary relation, I guess, like trivial there, and what is that like? And if I was not wrong, the it it should be avoid the focus truth, right? Focus truth, like P implies P, it and implies Q is valid there, but that's not relevant. Then it should, but I don't know, like as I remember, like Q implies P is valid there. I don't know, like if you take it as consequent. Yeah, just maybe just that, like maybe it's not, there's no connection about this and the theme of our discussion, but I think this
Okay.
is interesting to us.
All right. Look, let's set Rattler-Meyer semantics aside for the moment. I'll come back to that. Let's talk about impossible worlds. So let's start by talking about possible worlds. Now, I'm old enough to remember when they appeared on the scene, and they appeared on the scene with the work of Saul Kripke well, actually, that work's a bit older than me. So that started to appear in the late 50s, 1960s. So he introduced this technology of possible worlds. And there are certainly philosophical issues connected with possible worlds, such as their ontological status. In some sense, those questions haven't gone away. But when possible worlds machinery became available, largely because of the work of Saul Kripke, a lot of people found them possible worlds crazy. Yeah, there's only one reality. This is it. What the hell is a possible world? And I must confess, that was my view. But over the years, possible worlds have come to be accepted as perfectly legitimate technical machinery. I mean, they're just so technically useful. And in many ways, you know, my introduction to non-classical logic is built around the notion of a possible world. So I don't think possible worlds are contentious any longer in logic. Okay, there are still philosophical problems with what they are. Those haven't gone away, but the machinery is fine. Now, impossible worlds are worlds which are not possible, they're impossible. And in fact, the oldest notion of impossible worlds also goes back to Kripke. So when he produced his early papers on the semantics of modal logics, he needed worlds where the modal operators behave differently. So these are some of the weaker modal logics, S2 and S3. And he had a very basic idea of what such impossible worlds are. He didn't call them impossible worlds, that terminology is much later. But since Kripke's paper, impossible worlds have found many, many applications. Relevant logic is one of them. I'll come back to that. It's not the only one. So nowadays, impossible worlds have applications in, for example, theory of fictional objects, theory of counterfactuals, and theory of intentionality. We're not going to talk about all those. Let's just talk about fiction. So let's talk about Sherlock Holmes again. Oh no, let's talk about Sylvan's box. So in Sylvan's box, there's this object which is both empty and has something in it. All right, that's true in the fiction. Now, how do you understand truth in a fiction? Well, a standard story, probably going back to David Lewis, is that you need to understand truth in a fiction in terms of worlds. So to be true in a fiction is to be realized in all the worlds, to hold in all the worlds that realize the fiction. If you have that view, and I'm sympathetic to that view, you need impossible worlds because what goes on in a fiction can be impossible, like Sylvan's box. All right. Now, two things. There's a question of the mathematics of impossible worlds, and there are different kinds, and the mathematics is very well now understood. There aren't many technical problems about the mathematics of impossible worlds. We know how to define them, we know how to behave. That's not a problem. There are certainly philosophical issues about impossible worlds, because, I mean, the issue of what a possible world is still contentious. If there are impossible worlds, then you've got an extra level of complexity. For example, what's the ontological status of impossible worlds? Is that the same as the status of possible worlds, or do they have a different ontological status? People go different ways on that question. I'm inclined to think they all have the same ontological status. We can go to that if you want, but that's just my view. All right, so that's a sort of general story about impossible worlds. Now, let's come back to Ratley-Meyer semantics, which is the main focus of your question. So in modal logics, you have this binary accessibility relation, X, R, Y. And roughly speaking, it says that X, R, Y means from the perspective of the world X, the world Y is possible. Okay, well, that's a very intuitive notion. You know, you can give very common sense examples of that. In Ratley-Meyer semantics, you don't have a binary accessibility relation. To give the semantics of conditionals, you need a ternary relation, R, X, Y, Z. And what that means has always been contentious. You certainly deploy it to give possible worlds, or to get worlds of a certain kind. So you can apply it to get worlds where if P, then P fails. That certainly sounds like an impossible world. So using a ternary relation, you can certainly get impossible worlds of a certain kind. That's not contentious. In some ways, that was the real insight which delivered Ratley-Meyer semantics. But what the hell does it mean? No, that's a very good question. And for a long time, people complained that it's just a technical device. It has no meaning. Now, that view was a dominant view for a long time, but things have changed in the last 10 years or so, where philosophers have put forward views about what the ternary relation means. Look, I can give you the references if you like, because it gets a bit technical, but let me try to keep this as simple as possible. In the Ratley-Meyer semantics, a conditional if A then B is true to world X, just if for all Y and Z such that are X, Y, Z, if the antecedent holds at Y, the consequent holds at Z. It's hard to kind of do this without a blackboard, but look, if A then B holds at X, just if whenever R, X, Y, Z, and A holds at Y, B holds at Z. Okay, so what is this relationship? Well, it helps to think of conditionals as functions. Now, this is a standard thought in logic, and it's implemented in intuitionistic logic, for example, where you think of conditionals as a construction, which you can apply to the antecedent to give you the consequent, and constructions are functions. So the thought that conditionals are functions is standard enough in logic. Now, what R, X, Y, Z means is that if you take all the functions that hold at X, because these are conditionals, right? If you take all the functions that hold at X and apply them to the facts that hold at Y, then you get then you get the outputs that hold at Z. So RxYZ is actually implementing a notion of functional application, and functional application is very closely connected with the semantics of conditionals. So RxYZ is really a way of encoding functional application when conditionals are thought of as functions. Now, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I don't know how intelligible my explanation has been because it's a bit hard without a blackboard, but there are now in the literature a number of different explanations of the meaning of the ternary relation. If you're interested, I can send you some references, but I think now many people think that you can make perfectly good sense of the Rautli-Meyer ternary relation. Okay, I don't know how much of that explanation was intelligible. You can tell me.
Thank you, Graham. That's really enlightened me about, yeah, I just realized about that the implication is function, like, as you do in intuitionistic logic, like negation is function to the contradictory to the contradiction. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So thank you for all those insightful questions. They, I think, highlight just how deep and foraging thoughts themes truly are. But yeah, as we now move toward closing, I would like to ask Arnab, do you have any closing remarks before I close our session?
Yes, I have one more questions, I guess.
Maybe you can put it simple and then
Okay.
it's answerable to the
Yeah,
short.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Vito, for the time. Graham, I mean, the context in Indonesia is there may be some anti-logic or maybe anti-formal logic, especially because there are too many works in continentals like um, talking about gods and talking about Nietzsche and stuff. And your works is basically trying to capture their ideas. Like for example, Hegel. You are trying to capture Hegel of Gebungen, I guess, and you will formalize in your journals. And then your approach to polyvalent logic to Nagarjuna's is I think is a formal approach in philosophy and of course a philosophy of logic. And my question is, how do you respond to the potential critique, like applying modern formal logic to the ancient, or to the former philosophers or ancient texts as an anachronistic translations that misses the original intentions, maybe, or like original soteriological, I guess, or meditative purpose that for example in Nagarjuna about the tetralema, no sorry in Buddhism about tetralema, and Chatuskoti, yes, I'm sorry, and then that's kind of reducing a path to enlightenment or to understanding phenomenologically to being just a formal puzzle. What do you think about it? I want to
Yeah.
know about your opinion.
No, look, that's an interesting question. Let me answer this as simply as I can, although I'm going to have to speak for a minute. Look, what formal logic gives you is a toolkit. Logic is a toolkit. It gives you a conceptual apparatus for expressing views, figuring out what follows from them, what doesn't. Okay. And formal logic has been used like that in every philosophical tradition I'm aware of, whether it's Arabic, whether it's ancient Greek, whether it's Indian. I mean, that logic has always been applied that way. So there's nothing new in that use of logic. Now, Logic has evolved in 2,500 years, and we'd be a bit sad if it hadn't. And so we now have a much better tools. And I don't
Always
think
said
that's
too.
contestable. So we now have much better logical tools than we had, say, in the Arabic and Latin Middle Ages. And you can apply those tools in an illuminating way to do what logic was always meant to do, namely explore views and figure out what follows them and what doesn't, how to formulate the views precisely, and so on. Now, that doesn't mean you have to use these tools, okay? Philosophical toolbox is large, and formal logic is just one tool. And there are other tools which are very good. And sometimes the tools of formal logic may not be appropriate at all. So, I mean, I like phenomenology. I think it's a very powerful tool of analysis. But that too is a tool, and its use is interesting. It's a different tool, but it can be combined with the tools of formal logic to do even more powerful things when you put them together. So I'm not saying that you have to use the tools of formal logic. You don't. It's true that a lot of people who work in what's often now called European philosophy do not have those tools at their disposal because they've never been taught them. Okay? And that doesn't mean they can't do good philosophy. It just means they won't be able to use those tools for their benefits. So I'm not saying you've got to use the tools of formal logic, but I mean, sometimes the application is really useful. And let me finally come to the question of anachronism. Okay, suppose you use the tools of formal logic to investigate views which the people who formulated those views did not have at their disposal. Okay, and this might apply to Buddhists, it might apply to the Greeks, it might apply to the Ibn Sina, it might apply to Aquinas. And it's very standard for modern philosophers to use the tools of formal logic to analyze ancient views. It's done all the time with Plato, it's done all the time with Aquinas, it's started to be done with Ibn Sina, it's being done with Buddhist views. So it's now being done, and I think it's being done very profitably because we're learning a lot about these views by applying the tools and the conceptual framework of modern logic. Now, is it anachronistic? Well, yes, obviously, in one sense it is, because these guys knew nothing about it, so they would never have painted their own views in these terms. However, the fact that we've got better tools means that we can understand their views better than they could, because we can use the tools to see further, right? Now, that doesn't mean we're smarter than what they are. Doesn't mean that at all. It just means that we have tools that they didn't have, which we can use to understand their views better than they did. And now this might be Plato, it might be Ibn Sina, it might be Nagarjuna. So in that sense, it's not anachronistic. And it's always struck me as bizarre not to use the tools that you have at your disposal if they're appropriate. Let me give you an analogy. Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, a lot of it was burnt down. I forget how long ago it was, maybe 8 years ago. They used cranes. Now, Notre Dame Cathedral was not built with cranes because it was built in the 13th century or thereabouts. Does that mean they should have rebuilt Notre Dame Cathedral without cranes? That would have been really stupid, right? Because we've got better tools and we can do the job better than the medieval craftsmen did. Not to use cranes would have been really stupid. And I feel the same way about modern logic. If you've got these really powerful tools at your disposal, not to use them will be really stupid. Okay, So sorry, that's been a kind of long and convoluted answer to your question, but I mean, that's what I think.
Okay, thank you so much, Fabrice. Yeah, I think it's the same. Like,
Oh,
a formal approach is powerful, so why don't we use it? I mean, like anachronistic, yeah, as long as we're not trying to judge them because of our advances, because based on our tools or based on their lack of tools, is
Yeah.
yeah, it's okay, I think, because
Well,
we
look,
maybe we can see further than them.
sure. Look, all the great philosophers were innovators. Plato, Nagarjuna, Kant, Ibn Sina, they had no problems about innovation. And I don't think any of them would have problems about using subsequent innovations to articulate their own ideas if this was useful. I'm sure that Nagarjuna would have done that. I'm sure that Ibn Sina would have done that. I'm sure that Kant would have done that. These guys did not have any problem with using new tools.
Yeah, I agree completely. Thank you so much, Graham.
okay. Thank you, Anna, for the closing remarks, I think, and also the question. So, as we now move toward closing, maybe I would like to offer up maybe like a little notes or a final reflection, not to settle anything, but to acknowledge what this discussion has opened, and perhaps to point toward where thinking might go next. Not just as a moderator, but as a someone who has been challenged and learned a lot from tonight's discussion. So, yeah, I think uh, tonight discussions has shown us something rare, especially in Indonesia, that philosophy, even when deeply formal and technical, rigorous, or whatever it is, can still be a confrontation with our most fundamental assumption about reality. And it's so interesting for me about reasoning, even about ourselves. And yeah, especially through the lens of transconsistency, we are in here invited to reconsider what many of us were maybe taught to treat as unquestionable, like taken for granted. Uh, the idea that consistency is necessary, or that a contradiction is a failure, and that logic exists to preserve a single monolithic or just a coherent picture of truth. And yeah, as we have seen, as Graham has explained, contradiction may not be a sign of collapse. I think it may be a feature. As yeah, I really love uh, to highlight my question. So it may be a feature of reality itself, something to be understood, not erased. So I think if classical logic taught us that truth must never contradict itself, consistency in here remind us that reality maybe does not always obey our comfort, and perhaps the deepest honesty is the willingness to think even where the mind hesitates. So yeah, and the question is no longer about simply whether contradictions are permissible, but whether our concept of truth is large enough to accommodate the world as it is. So rather than the world as we would prefer it to be. So I think this session invited us to think again, to think not only within boundaries, but at boundaries. So Graham, before we close, is there any closing remarks you would like to leave us with?
Uh, Not really. Look, okay, just this. Philosophy has been evolving for thousands of years. It's not finished evolving. Who knows where it's going to go in the next 1,000 years if if the human race manages to live for another 1,000 years, which is a bit dubious at the moment. But as long as the human race is around, philosophy will evolve. If you want to be part of the discussion, you've got to keep an open mind and explore things that you might not have thought possible, because that every great advance in philosophy has arisen because people have challenged things which were taken to be orthodox and obvious, and fundamental advances in philosophy are not like that. So just when you're doing philosophy, keep an open mind, explore something. If it makes sense for you, go with it. If it doesn't, don't. That's all.
Okay, I love your point. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you, Graham, and thank you once again to everyone who joined us tonight. I'm not also so because we have a pretty limited time in here. So yeah, I would like to close this session. This has been a remarkable conversation, and we hope it continues beyond this event. So on behalf of Uberman's philosophy, and also Intuitionistic ID, and myself from Universitas Gadjah Mada, I would like to say thank you, and for everyone, stay curious and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank-
Thank you so much,
Thank you for
Graham.
having me, Vito. Thank you for your thoughts, and thank you to everybody else that's been involved in the conversation.
It's my pleasure, Graham. It's an honor to meet you. You're
Let's
my
go.
hero. Let's
I'm so
go.
happy.
I'm so happy
Thank you,
to meet
Graham.
you.
Okay. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.